The dog walked into the cemetery on his own, and that is where the morning stopped being ordinary. I had walked that ground 100 times. As the officer of the guard at the old garrison cemetery, I knew the shape of a funeral the way a sailor knows weather, the slow cars on the lane, the family clustered tight against the cold, the bearers measuring their steps so no one would have to think about how to walk. We were burying a young soldier of the house that morning, a rifleman named Corporal Tully who had died in a training accident at 23, and I had set my section the way I always do. 6 men in the cordon, 2 at the gate. The bearer party rehearsed until their boots fell as one boot. I was not expecting anything to surprise me. I had been doing this for 11 years. Then the old dog came through the gate, and not one of us moved to stop him. He was a brown and gray shepherd cross, the kind of dog you see asleep outside a farm gate, except this one was not asleep. He was thin in the way old dogs go thin, his muzzle gone white as frost, his hips low and careful. He came down the gravel lane with his nose working the air, slow and certain, the way a man walks a road he has not seen in years but has never once forgotten. He did not look at the cars. He did not look at us. He went past the gate guard, Private Reeve, who looked at me with a question on his face and got only my raised hand in answer, and he kept on toward the open grave, as if he had an appointment there that no one had thought to write down. I should have had him removed. That is the truth of it. A funeral of the house is a thing of order, and a loose dog is not order. But there was something in the way he walked that closed my mouth. He was not lost. A lost dog circles, sniffs, lifts its head at every sound. This one had a destination, and he was nearly at it. He stopped at the foot of the grave. He stood there a moment with his head lowered over the dark cut in the earth, and then, with a stiffness that made one of my younger men draw a quiet breath, he stepped to the side, onto the flat granite of the older headstone beside the new plot, circled once and lay down. He laid his white muzzle flat on the cold stone, and he sighed a long, settling sound, the sound a dog makes when it has finally reached the place it was trying to get to. The family had stopped walking. They stood on the lane in their black coats and watched the dog the way you watch something you do not understand but somehow recognize. I crossed to the headstone he had chosen. I did not want to, but I had to know whose grave he had lain on, because by then I already felt the cold weight of certainty in my chest that it was not random, that this dog had not wandered in off the lane and chosen a stone at chance. I read the name cut into the granite, and I stood very still for longer than an officer of the guard is meant to stand still in front of the people he is leading. The stone belonged to Sergeant Owen Brand, buried 4 years ago. And I knew that name, because Owen Brand had served in my own company before my time, and the older men still spoke of him. A quiet, square man who had been killed clearing a road of mines so a relief column could pass, and who had been buried here with the honors of the house, and whose dog, the old hand said, had walked at the foot of his coffin the whole length of the lane, and then would not leave the fresh earth for 3 days. I had heard that story the way you hear all old soldiers' stories, half believing, filing it under the things men tell to keep the dead close. The dog, they said, had been taken in by Brand's sister in the village. That had been 4 years ago. 4 years. And here he was, white-muzzled and stiff, lying on Owen Brand's stone while we buried a different man 20 feet away. I knelt by him. I am not a man who kneels easily in uniform, but I knelt, and I put my white glove flat on the granite beside his paw, and I felt how cold the stone was and how the dog had not flinched from that cold at all. He opened one eye at me, the milky brown eye of an animal who has outlived most of what he loved, and he did not move. He had not come to be petted. He had come home. "Sir," it was Reeve low at my shoulder. "There's a woman at the gate. She's been running, sir. She says the dog's hers." I rose. At the gate stood a woman of perhaps 50, gripping an empty leather lead, her breath fogging in front of her, her face the particular gray of someone who has been chasing something they were terrified of losing. I knew before she spoke that this was Brand's sister. He got out, she said, and her voice cracked on it. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I had the door open for the coal man and he never does this. He can barely walk. I didn't think he could. She stopped. She had seen over my shoulder where the dog was lying, and the fight went out of her all at once, and her hand with the empty lead in it dropped to her side. Is that, she said, is he on Owens? He is, I said. She put the back of her free hand to her mouth. I haven't been able to bring him, she said. These 4 years. The vet said his heart and his hips, I couldn't carry him and he wouldn't go in the car anymore, he'd just shake. I thought he'd forgotten. I hoped he'd forgotten, the poor old soul. I didn't want him grieving a man who's been gone 4 years. She looked at me and I saw she was asking me a question she did not have words for. How did he know the way? It's 2 miles. He's blind in one eye. How did he know? I did not have an answer. I am not sure there is one. But I have stood the watch over the dead for 11 years, and I have learned that there are things the living do for the dead that have no explanation except love. And I had just watched an old dog walk 2 miles on failing legs to lie down on the only stone in the world that mattered to him. I was not going to pretend it was nothing. Ma'am, I said, there is a funeral about to begin. I will be honest with you. By every rule I have, I should clear this ground and put your dog out the gate, and we should carry on. Her face closed, bracing for it. I am not going to do that, I said. And that decision, made in 10 seconds, in front of 2 grieving families and 8 of my own men, with my own sergeant major already moving toward me with a face like a coming storm, is the reason I am telling you this story at all. Because of what it cost, and because of what it bought. Sergeant Major Coyle reached me before the woman did. He is a good soldier and a better man than his face lets on, and he had been with the bearer party of the house for 19 years, which is to say he had buried more men than I had commanded. He kept his voice down, which with Coyle is a kind of mercy. Sir, he said, we have a hearse on the lane and a family in it. We have the chaplain timed to the minute, and we have a stray on a grave with the press of the local paper somewhere behind that wall because there is always one. He let that land. I can have Reeve carry him out quiet, 2 minutes. No one need remember it. He was right. Everything he said was right, and he was saying it the way a senior man says a true thing to a junior one he respects, not blocking me, just making certain I had seen the whole of the ground before I planted my flag on it. That is what a good sergeant major does. He shows you the cliff before you walk off it. How long has Corporal Tully's family been planning this morning? I asked him. He frowned, not following. Weeks, sir, same as any. And how long has that dog been planning it? Coyle looked at the old shepherd on the stone. Something moved behind his eyes. Coyle had carried Owen Brand's coffin. I would learn later, had been one of the 6. And the story of the dog at the graveside 4 years ago was not a story to him. It was a thing he had stood 3 feet from. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said very quietly, I carried Owen. I never forgot that dog. Then we agree, I said. We do not agree, sir, he said, but the storm had gone out of his voice, and what was left was something more like grief held at attention. We're about to risk a young soldier's funeral on a dog. If this goes wrong, if the family takes offense, if the order comes down, it falls on you. Not me. You. It falls on me, I said. Stand the bearer party easy. Hold the hearse 2 minutes more, and send word up the lane to Corporal Tully's father. Ask him, do not tell him, ask him, whether he would object to a soldier's dog resting near his son while we lay the boy to rest. If he objects, we clear the ground and I take whatever comes. Coyle held my eye 1 second longer than discipline required. Then he said, Sir, and turned and went. And that single word from that man was worth more to me than a medal, because it meant he would carry my order as if it were his own, even believing as he did that I was wrong. I went back to Brand's sister at the gate. Her name, she told me, was Margaret. The dog's name was Sable. I don't understand what's happening, she said. Neither do I told her. But I think Sable does, and I am not going to be the man who drags him off your brother's grave on the morning he finally got there. Will you trust me a few minutes?" She looked at the dog. She looked at the hearse on the lane, the young soldier's coffin inside it under the flag of the house, the family waiting. And she did a thing I have never forgot. She straightened her coat and wiped her face with the flat of her hand and said, "Owen would have held that hearse for any soldier's family in the world. So yes, I'll trust you, but you tell that boy's people I'm sorry and that my brother would have been proud to share his ground." Word came back down the lane faster than I expected. Corporal Tully's father, a heavy, gray man who worked the railway and had the look of a man holding himself up by the bones of his own discipline, did not send a message. He came himself, walking up the gravel between the graves with his cap in his two hands, and he stood looking at the old dog on the stone for a long moment. "That's a working dog," he said finally, not a question. "He was, sir. He belonged to a sergeant of this house, killed clearing a road 4 years ago." The father nodded slowly. Then he said the thing that turned the whole morning, the thing I have repeated to every young officer who has served under me since. "My boy wanted to be a soldier since he was 6 years old," he said. "He wanted it because of men like that. A dog that walked 2 miles to lie on his master's grave," his voice went, "and he mastered it and went on. That's the kind of loyalty my son was trying to be part of. You'll not move that dog on my account. You'll let him stay. And if it's not too much to ask," he looked at me, this grieving father, and asked me a favor at his own son's funeral, "let my boy go into the ground next to him. So Tully's not alone his first day. I have stood the watch over the dead for 11 years. I have rarely had to work so hard to keep my own face still." "It would be an honor, sir," I said. So we did not clear the ground. We changed the funeral instead. I will tell you that this is not a small thing. A funeral of the house is built like a watch movement, every gesture timed, every man's place fixed, the whole of it a machine for carrying grief that is too heavy for any one family to lift alone. You do not improvise inside it. You do not, on the morning, decide to let an old dog lie on the next stone over while the bearer party brings a coffin down the lane. There is no line in any order I have ever been issued that covers it. I was making it up, in real time, in front of 200 years of tradition, and I knew exactly how much trouble I could be in if a single thing went wrong. But I had been a soldier long enough to know the difference between the rule and the reason for the rule. The rule says, keep order, so the family is not made to manage chaos on the worst day of their lives. The reason is mercy. And there was nothing in that cemetery that morning more merciful than what was already happening on Sergeant Brand's stone, a creature who had walked 2 miles on a failing heart to be near a man who could not know he was there. To move him would have served the rule and betrayed the reason. I have spent my whole career trying to learn the difference, and that morning I think I finally did. I gave my orders quietly. The cordon would stand. The bearer party would proceed exactly as rehearsed, with one change. Their line of march would carry them past Sergeant Brand's stone, and as they passed it, they would not break stride and they would not look down, but Coyle at their head would render the slow eyes, right that we give a standard, given not to the living family on the lane but to the old dog and the man under the stone he guarded. I have never given that order before or since. I gave it once. The hearse came up the lane. The bearers took the weight of Corporal Tully onto their shoulders, and the boy went forward under the flag of the house, the family falling in behind, and the only sound was 8 pairs of boots on gravel and the high, thin call of a winter bird somewhere over the wall. Sable did not lift his head. He lay on Owen Brand's stone with his white muzzle flat on the granite, and as the bearer party drew level, Coyle's command came soft as a turned page, eyes right, and 8 heads turned. And for 3 measured paces, the men of the house paid their respect to a sergeant 4 years dead, and the dog who had not stopped keeping his watch. I watched Margaret's face when it happened. I watched her understand what she was seeing. Her hand came up to her mouth again, and she did not bother this time to hide that she was weeping, because there was nothing shameful in it. Half the people on that lane were weeping, and the other half were only managing not to. We laid Corporal Tully in the ground beside the old sergeant's grave. The chaplain spoke the words. The volley fired 3 rounds, clean and together, and I felt every man brace against the urge to look at the dog when the rifles cracked, because we none of us knew how an old, half-blind shepherd would take the sound of gunfire over his master's stone. He did not run. He did not so much as flinch. At the first volley his ears came up, and he lifted his white head off the granite, and he looked toward the rifles with the steady, knowing attention of an animal who had heard that sound in his life before and had learned, long ago, what it meant. Then, when the echo had rolled away off the cemetery wall and the bugler began the call we sound over our dead, the old dog did the thing that I have carried with me every day since. He stood up. It cost him. I could see it cost him. His back legs trembled with the effort, and for a moment I thought he would not make it up off the stone at all. But he got his feet under him, and he stood, stiff and shaking and white-muzzled on his master's grave, and he held that posture all the way through the bugle call, his good eye fixed on nothing the rest of us could see. I do not know what a dog hears in that call. I do not believe he understood it the way the men around him did. But I will go to my own grave certain that he knew what it was for. He had heard it once before, 4 years ago, over the box that held the only man he had ever belonged to, and he had not forgotten, not the sound, not the 2-mile road, not the stone. An old dog whose body had failed him in every other way had kept that one thing whole. When the last note died, he lay back down, slowly, carefully. He put his muzzle on the cold granite and he let out that long settling breath again, and he closed his eyes. Not a person on that lane moved. Corporal Tully's father stood at the foot of his son's open grave with the tears running into the lines of his face and made no move to wipe them. The chaplain had stopped, his book open in his hands, and was simply looking. My men held their dress, but I have stood beside guardsmen at attention for 11 years, and I know the difference between the stillness of discipline and the stillness of men who have been struck quiet by something larger than the parade. This was the second kind. We were all of us, soldier and family and stranger, held in place by an old dog and a winter morning, and a loyalty that had outlived the man it was given to. I have tried since to set down why it struck so deep, why grown men who had buried comrades and not broken stood on that lane with wet faces over a dog. I think it is this. A funeral is a thing the living do because we have learned we must. We are taught it. We rehearse it. We put on the uniform and make the gestures because the gestures hold us up when nothing else will. But the old dog had not been taught. No drill sergeant had marched him to that stone. No order had been read over him. He did the whole of it, the journey, the watch, the standing through the bugle out of nothing but what he was. And there is something in a soldier that aches at that, because it is the thing we are all reaching for under the drill and the brass, not the form of loyalty, but the fact of it, the kind that needs no order because it has become the creature entire. We spend our lives trying to make ourselves into men who would walk the 2 miles. The old dog simply was that, and had been the whole time, and had never had to try. Young Reeve, at the gate, told me afterward that he had joined the house because his grandfather had served, and he had wanted, vaguely, to belong to something that did not change. He said he had stood at that gate through 100 funerals and felt mostly the cold. But he said that, when the old dog stood up through the bugle on his shaking legs, something in him stood up too, and had not entirely sat back down since. He is a corporal now, and a good one, and I believe a part of the soldier he became was made on that lane that morning, by a teacher with 4 legs and a white muzzle who never knew he had a pupil. It was Margaret who broke it, and she broke it the right way. She walked out from the gate slowly, so as not to startle him, and she crossed the frozen grass to her brother's stone, and she knelt down beside Sable in her good black coat in the mud, and she put her arms around the old dog's neck and pressed her face into his fur. And she said something to him I was not meant to hear, but I heard it anyway because I was close, and because I have never been able to make myself forget it. "You found him," she said. "Good boy, you found him, he knew you'd come." And then a thing happened that I have never been able to tell without stopping. Corporal Tully's mother, the young soldier's mother, a small woman who had not let go of the folded flag of the house since Coyle had placed it in her hands, who had buried her only son not 10 minutes before, left her husband's side and walked across the grass to where Margaret knelt with the old dog. Two strangers, two griefs, one fresh and one 4 years old. She did not say anything for a moment. She just lowered herself down in her good black coat into the same cold mud, beside a woman she had never met and a dog she had never seen, and she put her hand on the old shepherd's flank, very gently, the way you touch something you are afraid is already too fragile to touch. And she said to Margaret, to the dog, to her son in the new ground, to no one, "Thank you for keeping him company tonight." That was all. "Thank you for keeping him company tonight." The two women knelt there together with their hands on an old dog, and I had to look hard at the far wall for a while, because there is only so much an officer of the guard can hold, and I was at the edge of it. I have thought about those two women since, about how grief is supposed to be a private thing, sealed inside a family, and how the whole architecture of a funeral is built to give each family its own walled hour with its own dead, and how an old dog had walked in off a country lane and knocked every one of those walls flat without meaning to, until a mother who had lost her boy that morning was thanking the keeper of a 4-year-old grave for the kindness of shared company in the dark. That is not in any order. That is not a thing you can drill. It happened because the old dog was there, and being there was the whole of what he had ever known how to do. I want to be honest with you about what I felt standing there, because I think it matters. I have buried a great many soldiers. I have learned to do it without breaking because the family needs the man in the uniform to be the still point they can lean against, and if I weep, then who is holding the line for them? That is the discipline. That is the whole of it. You hold so that they can fall apart safely. I have held at the graves of men I trained, men I led, men whose faces I still see. I held that morning too. But I will tell you, it was the closest I have ever come. What undid me was not the grief. I am armored against grief. It is my trade. What nearly undid me was the loyalty, the plain, dumb, magnificent fidelity of a creature who owed the world nothing and gave it everything anyway, who had been given 4 years to forget and had refused, who had spent the last strength in his old body to walk back to the one place that proved he had loved and been loved. We build whole armies on that. We carve it into stone over the gates of barracks, faithful unto the end. And here it was, made flesh and fur and trembling on a grave, teaching it to 200 years of soldiers who thought they already knew. We finished the funeral the way it ought to be finished. Corporal Tully was laid down, and the flag was folded, Coyle folding it, his big hands precise as a watchmaker's, and the folded flag of the house was given into the hands of the boy's mother, and the family stood a while at the graveside as families do, not yet able to leave. And the old dog stayed where he was, on the next stone over, and no one asked him to move, and somehow his being there made the parting easier rather than harder. The boy was not going into the cold alone. There was an old soldier's dog keeping the watch beside him on his first night in the ground, and a sergeant of the house underneath to share it. I have never seen a thing I could less explain do more good. It was while the family lingered that Coyle came and stood beside me, and for a while neither of us spoke, 2 soldiers watching an old dog the way men watch a fire. Then he told me, lo, what he knew of Owen Brand, because I had only the half of it the old hands tell, and Coyle had the whole. Brand had found Sable as a pup, he said, thrown out near a checkpoint, a starving scrap of a thing nobody wanted. He had fed him from his own ration and built him a bed out of a kit bag, and against every regulation he had kept that dog at his side for 9 years. The dog had learned the calls. He knew the difference between the morning call and the evening one, knew reveille from retreat, would not eat until Brand did, and had once, the men swore, walked 3 days across broken country to find his sergeant when they had been separated in the field. That dog, Coyle said, was Owen's whole softness, a hard man otherwise. You'd not have wanted to cross him, but he'd give you his last cigarette and he'd not let a soul speak ill of that animal. He was quiet a moment. When Owen went down on that road, clearing it so the rest of us could come through, it was the dog they couldn't manage after. He sat by the place. He would not be moved. We carried Owen home, and that dog walked the whole way at the foot of the box, and then he lay on the fresh grave 3 days and would not eat, and in the end it was Margaret who got him up, because she's the only living soul he ever loved a fraction as much. We thought that was the end of it. We thought he'd settle into being an old farm dog. Coyle looked at the white-muzzled shape on the stone. He never settled. He was just waiting till his legs would carry him one more time. I think of that often, that the 4 years had not been forgetting. They had been waiting. The morning the door stood open, the old dog had not wandered out by accident. He had spent the last of himself the way a soldier spends the last of himself, to keep a post he had been given, to honor a thing he had sworn, in whatever wordless oath a creature like that can swear. 2 miles across roads he could not see well, past every distraction a town can put in front of a hungry old animal, on a heart the vet had already written off, and not one wrong turn. He had not been finding the grave. He had been reporting for duty. I should tell you what it cost, because the Bible of my trade says the easy choices are not worth the telling, and only the dear ones are. By that afternoon the story was loose. There had been, as Coyle predicted, a man from the local paper somewhere behind the wall, and he had a photograph. The old white-muzzled dog standing stiff on the granite while the bearer party rendered eyes, right, the winter light flat and gray, no faces clear enough to shame anyone. It ran the next morning under 3 words that I did not write and could not have bettered: the faithful sentry. By the 2nd day it had left the local paper and gone everywhere, the way these things do now, carried by people who would never set foot in a garrison cemetery but who understood, in the plain language of the heart, exactly what they were looking at. And the order came down, just as Coyle had warned me it might. I was summoned to the colonel of the house. I will not pretend I made that walk without a stone in my stomach. I had improvised inside a sacred thing. I had altered a funeral of the house on my own authority, on the morning, on the strength of a feeling about a dog. If the colonel chose to make an example of me, the rules were entirely on his side, and I had no defense except the one I have given you, which is that I had judged the reason for the rule to outrank the rule itself. And that is precisely the judgment a junior officer is most often wrong to trust in himself. The colonel was an old man with a face like the cemetery wall, and a reputation for never once in 40 years having let sentiment move him a single inch off the regulation. He had the newspaper on his desk. He had my written report beside it. I had written the whole of it out, plainly, claiming none of it as anyone's doing but mine, because if it was going to fall on someone, it was going to fall on the man who gave the order. He read for a long time without speaking, and I stood at attention and waited to learn what 11 years had been worth. "You held a hearse," he said at last, "and a grieving family, and you altered the order of a funeral of this house, on the strength of a stray animal. Is that an accurate summary, Captain?" "It is, sir." "You understand there is no provision for what you did. None. I have searched for it. A man could read every standing order this house has issued since its founding, and find no line that permits an officer to render military honors to a dog." "I understand that, sir. I did not render the honors to the dog. I rendered them to a sergeant of this house who died clearing a road for other men, and who was, that morning, the only soldier in that cemetery with someone standing the watch over him who had walked 2 miles to do it. The dog was where the loyalty was. I went to the loyalty." The colonel set the paper down, and the old man who had never let sentiment move him an inch looked at me for a long moment, and then he did something I had not braced for, because I had braced only for the punishment. He stood up, and behind that cemetery wall face, very quietly, he said, "I carried Owen Brand's father's coffin, Captain, 41 years ago. Brands have served this house for 3 generations, and every one of them died doing something for somebody else." He came around the desk. "There is no provision for what you did, so I am going to make one." He had me draft it myself. It went into standing orders 3 weeks later. 2 clean sentences under a heading I will not give you in case you go looking for the house. But the sense of it was this: that the cemetery of this house holds soldiers, and a soldier's loyalty does not always wear a uniform, and that any animal that has served a soldier of the house or kept faith with one may rest in its ground near the grave it keeps. It is, I am told, the only order of its kind in any service. I drafted it. The colonel signed it, and I have never in my life been prouder of 2 sentences. Before he dismissed me, he asked one question more, and it was not the question of a colonel to a captain. He asked it as one old soldier asks another. "When the dog stood up through the call," he said, "tell me he did not just stand because the rifle startled him. Tell me what you saw, and tell me true, because I will not write an order on a flinch." I told him true. I told him the dog had not flinched at the volley, that he had lifted his head and looked toward the rifles the way a man checks a sound he already knows, and that it was only when the bugle began, when the call sounded that he had heard once before over the only man he ever loved, that he rose. I told him the rifles had not moved that dog an inch. The call had. The colonel was quiet a long moment, and then he nodded once slowly, the way men of his age nod when something has settled in them that will not come unsettled again. Then he stood for the right reason, he said, "which is more than I can say for half the men I have commanded. Dismissed, Captain, and well done." He had never said those 2 words to me in 4 years of service. He did not say them lightly. I carried them out of that office like a man carrying water in his cupped hands, afraid to spill a drop. But the part of this I most need you to have is what happened to Sable, because a story about loyalty owes you the truth of how it ended. We did not put him out the gate. Margaret took him home that afternoon. She had to lift him into the car at the last. The old dog, too, spent to climb in, and he did not shake or fight it that day. He had done the thing he had set out to do, and there was a peace on him after, she told me, that she had not seen in 4 years. But she could not keep him from the cemetery after that. Twice more in the weeks that followed, she found the door open and the lead empty, and both times she came up the lane at a run to find Sable already there on Owen Brand's stone, his muzzle on the granite, keeping the watch. After the second time, she stopped fighting it. She brought him herself on the good days. In the car he no longer feared, and she would sit on the bench by the wall with her flask of tea while the old dog lay on his master's grave, and Reeve or one of the other lads would bring her out a chair if it was cold, and no one ever once asked them to leave because they did not have to anymore. The order saw to that. He went in the spring. Margaret told me it was in his sleep, by her own fire, on a soft evening with the window open to the garden, which is as much as any of us could hope for ourselves. She telephoned the cemetery before she telephoned anyone else. "I want to bring him to Owen," she said. Am I allowed?" "Truly." "Ma'am," I said, "there is an order. You are allowed." So we buried the old dog where he had spent the last strength of his life trying to be. We did it quietly, no volley, no bugle. He had earned more dignity than spectacle. But I will tell you that I put on my dress that morning, and Coyle put on his, and we were not the only ones. Word had gone around the barracks, the way it does, and when Margaret arrived with the small box she had made ready, she found that she was not the only mourner. The bearer party had come on their own time. Half my section, Reeve at the gate as he had been on the first morning. Corporal Tully's father was there in the same heavy coat because he had asked Margaret to send him word, and she had. We had told no one to come. They came. We laid Sable at the foot of Sergeant Owen Brand's grave, between the sergeant and the young corporal whose first night in the ground the old dog had kept. And Coyle, who had carried Owen's coffin and never forgotten the dog at the graveside, knelt and set the last spadeful himself, which is a thing the sergeant major of the bearer party does not do, and did anyway. And when it was done, with no order given and no provision for it in any standing order ever written, the men of that bearer party came to attention at the foot of a dog's grave, and they rendered the slow eyes right and held it 3 measured paces worth, the way we do for a standard, the way we had done on the morning he first found the place. There was no one to command it. They simply did it. I have served the house my whole adult life, and I have rarely been so glad to stand among the men I stand among. Margaret put up a small marker in time when the ground had settled, granite to match her brother's. She asked me what it should say, and I told her that was hers to choose and no one else's, but she wanted to know what a soldier would put, and so I told her the words that are over the gate of the oldest barracks of the house, the words we give our own. She used them. The marker is small and low, and you would not see it unless you knew to look, down at the foot of 2 soldiers' graves, and it carries a name and 2 dates, and underneath them 3 words, faithful unto the end. There is no rank on it. Sable did not need one. He had outranked every easy thing in life, comfort and forgetting, and the failing of his own body, by simply refusing to stop loving a man who was gone. I go past it on my rounds. I have buried a great many more soldiers since that winter, and I will bury a great many more before I am done, and I have held the line at every one of them, the way the family needs me to hold it. But I will tell you that on the mornings when it is hardest, when the coffin is small, or the family cannot stand, or the boy in the box was 23 and meant to be the start of something, I find my eyes going, just for a breath, to that low gray stone at the foot of 2 soldiers, and the 3 words on it, and I think of an old half-blind dog walking 2 miles on a failing heart because there was a place he had promised, in whatever way a dog makes promises, that he would always come back to. And it steadies me. It has steadied 200 men. Because the whole of what I do, the watch over the dead, the holding of the line, the discipline that lets the living fall apart safely, the whole of it rests on one idea, and that idea is loyalty, that a man will keep faith with those he serves and those he loves, to the end, past comfort, past sense, past the point where anyone would blame him for laying it down. We dress that idea in red wool and brass and teach it on the parade square and carve it over our gates. And then one gray winter morning, an old dog came in through the gate and lay down on a stone and taught it to all of us at once, with no words and no rank and no provision in any order, better than any of us had ever managed to teach it to ourselves. People ask me sometimes how the dog knew the way. 2 miles, half-blind, 4 years gone, on legs that could barely carry him. I used to say I didn't know. I have a better answer now. He knew the way because he never stopped knowing it. We are the ones who forget. The dead slip back from us a little every year, until we have to set aside a mourning and a uniform and a folded flag just to bring them close again for an hour. But the old dog had not let go of his sergeant for one single day in 4 years. The grave was not a place he had to find. It was a place he had never, for one moment of his loyal old life, actually left. That is the watch. That is what the rest of us are only practicing for. He found the grave because, in every way that matters, he had been standing the watch over it all along.